reading this most fantastic book, which is a total revelation about the Balfour Declaration. It's absolutely packed full of, not only of facts, many of which I was not aware of, but it's also a brilliantly written book and full of caustic and wry comments on the British, on Balfour, on Lloyd George. And I'm going to give you a few quotes from the book. It's by a man called J.N.M. Jeffries. It's called Palestine the Reality. And it was written in 1938. This man had immense experience of the Middle East in general and Palestine in particular. He was very close to all the players, Arab and Jewish and British, in the proceedings of the First World War, post-First World War, and followed, of course, for the Northcliffe Press. He was a correspondent for the Daily Mail, which was a much more eminent and respectable newspaper in those days than it is now. And it's absolute gold dust. Unfortunately, it's long out of print, and I suspect I may be holding one of the only copies in London, so I watch it very carefully. But J.N.M. Jeffries described the Balfour Declaration and the way in which it was conceived and delivered this way. And I think it sums it up. And what you've already heard, and what I'm going to tell you, I think will prove this to be a most accurate quote. He said, "Unlawful in issue, arbitrary in purpose, and deceitful in wording, the Balfour Declaration is the most discreditable document to which a British government has set its hand within memory." Later on, another quote of his, which I rather like, is when he made, after the British got their hands, the British appropriated the mandate for Palestine. In effect, what happened was that Sir Arthur Balfour, as I think he still was then, in his position as a member of the Council of the League of Nations, asked Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Minister of Britain, if he'd like to have the mandate for Britain, for Palestine. To which Arthur Balfour, in his hat in London, said to Arthur Balfour, sitting at the Council of the League of Nations, "Yes, please, thank you." So the British awarded themselves the mandate because of the powerful position they'd acquired in the League of Nations and in the Council of the League of Nations. Their next step at the League of Nations, having fiddled with the covenant of the League of Nations to make it possible to deny Palestine the independence which the thrust of the League of Nations had required, was to fiddle with the mandate, fiddling the mandate into the Balfour Declaration, part of which process was, instead of guaranteeing Palestine independence, was to guarantee the power of the Zionists in Palestine. And Jeffries describes this in this brief way: "Never has perjury worn a bolder face." I mean, he's full of remarks like this, but one of the ones I really like is, of course, the Balfour Declaration itself was written, as we've heard from Carl, by a team of Zionists and Zionist rewrite men. It was also sub-edited by Mr. Justice Brandeis of the US Supreme Court, who was the leader of American Zionism. And it was thus, it was a product of the Zionists, which Balfour signed. And at the end of the declaration, Balfour says to Lord Rothschild, to whom the letter was addressed, he says, "I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation," about which historian Jeffries writes, "Nothing more cynically humorous than the final couple of lines of this letter has ever been penned." So, one of the aspects of the Balfour Declaration that intrigued me, and I found out this reading Jeffries and reading the papers, another very good book which is available, it's called The Palestine Papers, Seeds of Conflict, which is just the papers, there's no commentary really, it's just linking the two, it's very, very valuable, is that in fact the first 3 years of the British mandate in Palestine were illegal. We were in an illegal occupation. And the reason this happened was this way: that the military administration, which the British instituted when they'd driven the Turks out of Palestine in 1917, and it effected an armistice with Turkey in 1918, a military administration took over, which was valid and legal under the rules of laws they obtained, and this had been brought up to date in 1907. Now, the military administration in Palestine, under a man called Sir Louis Bolz, tried to govern Palestine according to the rules of law, which meant that you administered the place, you kept law and order, basically you kept the peace, but you looked after people, but you could not change the way in which the country was ruled. In other words, the Ottoman laws, which had obtained for centuries in Palestine, still obtained under British military rule. And the British military got into a great deal of trouble with the Zionists because they refused the Zionist advances which were already being made. Zionists were visiting, Zionists were emigrating to Palestine, they were demanding special privileges, the British government were giving them special privileges in Palestine, and the army, the officers of the army were trying to prevent this. And sometimes they were quite effective. But nearly all the time the army was denied it was denied its power by Whitehall. The Zionists would go around the army, get their instructions countermanded in Whitehall, and the army became, frankly, a pain for the Zionists. And they inveigled the British government in 1920 into setting up a civil administration. Now that civil administration was illegal because at that time the Treaty of Sèvres, which Carl was talking about, had not been signed. We did not have peace with Turkey. And you cannot have a civil administration in occupied territory until you have peace with the country with which you've been at war. Peace with Turkey wasn't signed, the treaty wasn't ratified until 1923. So for those 3 years, the British rule in Palestine was illegal, was in contravention of the law, of international law. But nobody knew about this. Everything was, so many other things were going on that it wasn't publicized. The only 2 papers in Britain which published any news about Palestine at all were the Manchester Guardian, which was in the hands of the Zionists. As we've heard, one of the Manchester Guardian's journalists, Mr. Sacker, was one of the authors of the Balfour Declaration. The Times was a mouthpiece for the government, and the only newspaper much later on which started to take up the Palestinian cause was the Daily Mail. So the public were uninformed, the Arabs were uninformed. The Balfour Declaration wasn't read to the Arabs until 1920 in Nablus. It was the first public pronouncement of the Balfour, the contents of Balfour. So in those 3 years, everything the British did, encouraging Jewish emigration, allowing the development of a parallel Zionist government. In 1920, Jabotinsky, a very famous revisionist Zionist, started the Haganah, the parallel underground Jewish army. There were Zionist courts were set up for Jews. Jews were given equal rights in Palestine to the natives, despite the fact that they were less than 10% of the population. And development contracts, which were given exclusively to a man called Rutenberg, who was a Russian Jew, exclusive contracts for the development of Palestine, the water, the electricity, right across the country. No one else was allowed to apply, British, Arabs. It was a complete and utter act of illegality for those 3 years. But in those 3 years, the groundwork for Palestine was set. And it was done by devious footwork, by the force majeure of the British, by their cleverness at tricky wording, their access through the League of Nations in violating the covenant and violating the mandate by inserting the Balfour Declaration into it. It's a piece, I think, of absolutely stunning treachery by the British. And one thing we have to bear in mind is that in 1915, the British had promised King Emir Faisal, who was the head of the Arab world at that stage, the head of Arabia, they had promised that if the Arabs came in on the British side, the Arab Arabia, Syria, the Arabs would be given independence and self-rule. So at the same time they were making that promise, the British were continuing to break that promise. Now, to pick up Carl's point, why is it relevant now? Well, I think one of the points that we can see from this is that the public and the politicians in Britain were very largely kept ignorant of what was going on. At the time, of course, there were great distractions. The First World War had ended, there had been massive losses, there were big quarrels with the French about the divisions of the spoils in Europe, there were quarrels about what to do with Germany, reparation. There was a lot going on that dominated the press headlines. So the British were able to operate in the dark. The newspapers were kept out of the private meetings. The press did not have access to the chicanery that the British were operating, the private meetings, the peace talks. And in other words, lack of information was key. And I think that, what we can take from this is that now, still, there is a tremendous lack of information to the public now about what's happening in the Middle East, and it's the same thing that's going on. We're misled by the press, by the media, by the BBC in particular, about the nature of the conflict in Palestine. Just to give you one example, recently, when the Israelis carried out heavy air raids against Gaza, a sort of miniature cast length, the same thing happened again. The press reports that the responsibility lies with the Palestinians fire rockets, and therefore the Israelis have to retaliate. Well, of course, it's disproportionate retaliation, but why do the Palestinians fire the rockets? We get no context, we get no reporting on the condition of the Palestinians, the siege of Gaza, the occupation, the terrible life the Palestinians lead at the point of Israeli guns. It's difficult for the history of Palestine to be repeated in each news story, of course, but the context is missing. Anybody who knows the history, knows the chicanery of the Balfour Declaration, knows how the Israelis are treating the Palestinians, would understand why these clashes happen in Palestine. The other thing that struck me recently, looking at the media, is that while the press on the whole here, the media, have been reporting relatively accurately the Arab Spring, the Arab uprising, they've been congratulating in a way, they've been for the uprising against the various Arab dictators. I'll hold this in. There's been no such enthusiasm for any kind of uprising amongst the Palestinians. Well, no comparison, I've seen no comparison in the British media between the oppression that the Palestinian Arabs are suffering in Israel, which is surely as oppressive as any Arab regime, in the same way that they've been covering the Arab Spring. So there's a double standard going on here, and there's a lack of information, just as there was at the same time in 90 years ago when the Balfour Declaration was being scurried and inveigled through. Well, just one other thing, I noticed the other day the Daily Telegraph, which I suppose we shouldn't be surprised by this, but it's a good example of the way things are being reported at the moment. There's a whole half page in the Daily Telegraph, an interview with Ehud Barak about the Iranian, alleged Iranian attempt to make a nuclear weapon. Now, this interview, it's half a page, as you can see, a very flattering picture of this man in the middle of it, is completely unquestioning of him. The reporter does not challenge him once. Every statement, every fact, every figure given by this Israeli man, this Israeli defense minister, is used as if it were golden truth. He is not challenged as to Israel's own nuclear program. He is not challenged as to why Israel hasn't signed the non-proliferation treaty. He is not challenged on the question of the fact that Israel, it's alleged, its existence is in order. He has just allowed half a page in the Daily Telegraph, with a supporting leading article, by the way, to give the statement as if he paid for a full page advertisement. Now that sort of reporting, I'm afraid, is not confined to the Daily Telegraph. We see it in all the major newspapers, I'm afraid, and we see it especially in the BBC's lack of attention, lack of contextual reporting of what's going on in Israel. In other words, the carelessness, the misinformation and the lack of information that surrounded and coloured the whole arena of Balfour and what that meant to the Palestinians continues today as virulently. And the illegality of Britain's 3 years of occupation of Palestine between 1920 and 1923 at the point of the gun is mirrored today in Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem since 1967. And you could well argue that the occupation of Palestine goes further than that and has really been in effect since 1917. Thank you.